Hey fearsome friends, and a Merry Christmas to you all. I really hope you have a wonderful day, where I give to you a disturbing set of Christmas tales to listen to. So sit back in front of an open fire, cocoa in hand, and your loved ones surrounding you, because it's time to let your nightmares in. Such a lovely, heartwarming holiday to relax and enjoy with your family. Everyone has at least one fond Christmas memory. And if you say you don't, well, you're just straight up lying to yourself. I am no exception to those with happy memories of the festive day. Drinking cocoa, relaxing by the fire, hanging up ornaments with my family. The usual things a child would enjoy during the holiday season. However, there is one Christmas I would never forget, but not in a good way. The year was 2009 and I was 5 years old, living in a large farmhouse off in rural Fairmont, Indiana. We usually spent Christmas at my grandmother's house, but this year we decided to do it at ours. The setup was perfect. We had lights on the front of the house and barn, festive tablecloths, and of course the big shining pine tree in the living room, decorated with lights, ornaments, tinsel, the lot. December came and went quickly, with joyful occasions and activities being done with the family, everything going smoothly and to plan. And soon enough it was Christmas Eve. The young me bounced around the house in my pajamas with relentless, unending energy, and each time I passed the living room I eyed the tree, specifically of course the gifts that lined the floor underneath it. Presents just for me. Well, and my step-siblings, of course, but that didn't matter. This little routine of mine continued for several minutes, until my mother told me it was time to go to bed. With some protest, I was eventually tucked under the covers and sent to sleep, my unlimited bounty of energy now seeming to have been depleted entirely, and it wasn't long before my eyes closed and I drifted off into the grasp of sleep, with hopes of Santa coming through the night in my thoughts. However, later on I was awakened by a loud thud, which made my eyes gently flutter open, though they were still droopy and my body groggy. But through my hazed and exhausted vision, I could just make out a figure of something in next to the front door. I assumed the thud had been the slamming shut of it, but as I was looking I could see it was a tall and incredibly thin figure, almost sickly, and I couldn't make out any facial features with it being so far away and me being so tired. I could, however, see that its face was partially shrouded by a veil of thin, dishevelled, greasy hair that was missing clumps from the scalp area, as if it had forcibly torn it out itself. Adorning its head along with the hair were two long, twisted horns, like some sort of billy goat. Now this sight was enough to make my head spin. Was this Santa? That's what went through my mind as it looked around, hunched over like an animal searching for prey to pounce on. Eventually it seemed to have locked its gaze on me though, turning its head and popping sounds from its neck like it were painfully cracking it with each change of an angle. My body immediately froze, a light gasp trying to leave my throat, but not a single sound coming out. My sleepy eyes were now wide, locked onto the hidden face of the thing standing before me as it tilted its head curiously. I couldn't see a mouth, but it just felt like it was giving me a malicious grin. Quickly my hands threw the covers over myself, clutching them and holding them like a shield. Something any child would do for comfort in this situation. And I truly believed that the blankets were valuable protection. Almost as soon as I did that though, a rasping, harsh breath could be heard coming from the creature's direction. Then I began to hear a light thumping against the creaky wooden floorboards of my bedroom. Then the footsteps, approaching slowly, monotonously. Now my room was very large. It was actually one of the two living rooms, but was turned into a bedroom for me whilst my parents took my older, smaller one and gave their old room to one of my step-siblings, just so all of us kids could have a room of our own. Even so, and with the slow pace of the footsteps, it seemed like it was growing closer rapidly. Closer and closer, almost lined up with the sound of my heartbeat. My breath was shaky as it approached. Then, nothing. The footsteps stopped just beside my bed, so I did my best to hold my breath, frozen with complete terror. I then felt something thin and jagged touch the blanket at my feet. A finger? I believe it was, although it could have been anything. Slowly, very slowly, it was dragged upwards, passed by my feet, then up my legs through the blanket. My body trembled, my face beginning to burn up from how long I'd been holding my breath. It was travelling at such a painfully slow pace, trailing up the covers, feeling me through them, until it stopped abruptly at my head. It pressed down rather hard in a spot on my temple, and I let out a strained cry, unable to hold it in anymore. The thing seemed to hesitate for a moment before I heard what I believed to be a gravelly, raspy chuckle as it continued to press down. I swear that it ended up tearing through the blanket, because I could feel the bony fingernail digging into my flesh. It was as if the thing was testing me to see how much pain I could take. I sobbed softly to myself, trying to call out for my mother to come and protect me. But like all of my other futile attempts to produce words, nothing but air exited my mouth. Soon enough, the thing began to trail down my face again with its fingernail. However, this time it was still pressing down forcefully, and the nail left a small 1-inch cut along my temple before the pressure was relieved and the finger was pulled away entirely. Then something that sounded like a painful gurgling rang throughout my room until my eyes were met with a shadow in front of me, seen through the thin blankets. It must have been that creature coming face to face with me, my eyes wide with horror as it grew closer and closer, until I could feel its hot, sour breath puff through the cheap fabric. And after that, the feeling was immediately gone. I heard the footsteps again, except this time they were moving away from my bed, back into the direction they had come from. Another gurgling sound filled my ears as it left, lingering in my thoughts, and soon enough I heard something moving its way up the stairs, opening a door and closing it, before everything seemed to stop. After a minute of agonizing silence and the prayers that it was completely gone, I shakily lowered my covers, to reveal nothing. I don't recall much of the rest of that night, other than me cautiously going to the bathroom to clean up a bloody nose that had suddenly made itself known after I revealed myself from my covers. At the time I chalked it up to the humidifier, which had the tendency to make my nose bleed rather frequently at night. Then the next morning I opened my presents slowly, without a word. My mother had noticed the small nick on my head, and concerned questioned me as to what had happened. I lied, saying I was tired and had tripped and fell against my bedpost. I didn't want to frighten her with any mention of the thing that had been in my room. After that Christmas Eve night, I haven't seen any trace of that monster, no evidence that it even existed. Though to this day I still ponder, each Christmas season when I remember it at the corner of my mind, just what exactly was that thing? A sick, messed up person dressed up in a costume, looking more terrifying because of my grogginess. Some sort of, dare I say it, demon. I can't quite tell for sure, but I do know one thing. That was not Santa Claus. I could never sleep well in hotels. Actually, that's somewhat of an understatement. I could never sleep well in general, but hotels were the worst. Just the thought that the previous occupant of the bed I was in, a complete stranger, and that was repulsive to me. But that's beside the point. What I'm getting at is how this lack of sleep in hotels changed my life. And Christmas we were spending in a crappy hotel, and not with family. Great. Now don't get me wrong, it's not like I didn't enjoy the all-you-can-eat buffet of soggy hash browns and grits for Christmas Eve dinner. But the first snow of the season had cancelled our flight down to Virginia, so I was a bit annoyed. So it was Christmas Eve and I was trying to sleep in this bleach-saturated room, my mind wandering, trying to figure out what had happened in here to cause such an excessive amount of bleach needed. The room was nothing out of the ordinary. 2 double beds, a bathroom, and a stained microwave that looked in need of a good clean. My dad and I were in one bed, and my sister and Mom were in the other, and somehow I escaped the room, and stench of bleach, and went into a dreamless sleep. Waking up, I could tell it was early morning, and my dad was next to me snoring. He usually wakes up before 4 a.m. though, and that's when it hit me. It was Christmas, and I was about to let this bad fortune ruin my favourite holiday. When I looked across the bed at the clock to check the time, that's when I noticed it. A silhouette of a man about 6'3" staring at my mum sleeping across the room. Still half asleep myself and caught up in the moment, I couldn't help thinking of Santa Claus. I quickly realised how stupid the thought was though, and horror soon filled my head as I choked back a shriek. I knew I couldn't let him see me awake, so I quietly put my head back down and pretended to sleep. My mind was racing. Someone was in our room and I couldn't do anything about it. I was a scrawny 16-year-old, and this man looked like he was built like an ox. I wondered if I could wake my dad, but I knew that wouldn't work as he always slept like a rock. A bucket of water wouldn't get him up fast enough. So I was practically in tears, and I'd never felt so helpless. For a second time I choked back a scream as he was now standing right next to me, and I could feel and hear his repulsive breath on my face. It smelled like he'd been eating rotten meat for a week, with no thought to brush his teeth. If he didn't know I was awake before, surely he did now as my face was contorted in fear, and he could see that. The breathing stopped just then, and I couldn't help but give a sigh of relief. Then I heard the room door open and close. I launched out of bed and could see that nothing in the room was in disarray. My family was still fast asleep. It couldn't have been a dream. I couldn't have imagined it, and feeling more awake than ever, a horrible idea popped into my head. But before I could push it away, I was pulling the door open. Glancing back to the door in order to memorize our room number, I could see a giant X had been spray painted in black on the door. Now, had I seen this not having the prior experience I'd had, I probably would have thought it was just some stupid kids. But I knew better, though not enough to know what it was for exactly. Just then my heart skipped a beat. He was there, turning the corner at the end of the hall. Why am I doing this? I thought as I tailed him down to the parking lot. He was nowhere in sight though. One moment he was walking out of the lobby, then the next he was gone. Realizing how cold it was outside in paper-thin pajamas, I returned to the lobby, but no one was around, which was strange, as I could swear there was usually a night concierge. Adrenaline wearing off, I realized how stupid and rash my actions had been, as he could have killed me, and I cursed myself back up the stairs. I knew something was wrong when I got to my floor then, as the door to my room was wide open, and I was sure I hadn't left it that way. Had I? I made my way in, and after a quick search of the room, determined it to be safe and my family was still asleep. So I locked the door and got back into bed, though I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I eventually heard my dad get up and my mum followed, but I pretended to be asleep. Then a few hours passed and my parents got my sister and I up. We got into the car and made our way back to the airport. However, digging through my bag to grab my iPod lead, I found something that hadn't been there the day before. It was a note that read, "I knew you were awake." And those 5 words still stick with me to this day. It's now been 2 months since the hotel experience, and I'm still scared for my life. It gets worse every day. That note that I found wasn't the only one too. I'm still receiving them. Every year around the Christmas holiday, magic seems to always be around. Some things are marvelous and joyful, like visits from Santa or a snowman coming alive, and many people say they can feel the Christmas magic in the air. However, some things aren't so joyful. Around Christmas every year, kidnappings, murder and suicide rates go up drastically, and even when horrid things like this happen, people often feel, yet rarely do they admit, that they still feel a kind of holiday magic behind it, albeit a dark magic. One example comes from a Christmas demon known as the Krampus. The Krampus is well known in countries like Germany and Switzerland for taking naughty children in the dead of Christmas Eve night, and here is one such account. My name is Eli Rockford, and it is December 6th, 2013, and I'm currently 7 years old as I write this. I confide in this journal something I can't tell my family, because they would never believe me. I am often told that I am very smart for my age, because I say and do things that most kids my age don't. But if I tell a strange story, no matter how hard I get them to believe me, my parents and siblings say it's just my imagination. Today I looked out of my window into the street by our house and saw a man who looked like a shadow with horns. His eyes glowed orange, and seeing him scared me a lot. Then I heard a knock on the front door. I went down to see who it was, and when I got there, someone stuck a card through our mail slot and quickly ran off. The card had a picture of a monster who had bull legs, a tail and horns on a scary-looking goat head that looked half-human, and I was so scared that it was the thing in the street. But I don't know what to do. I think I know what it is, but I hope I'm wrong. I showed the card to my dad and he said it was Krampus. The bottom of the card said, Gross von Krampus, and Daddy said that every year Krampus punishes bad boys and girls on Christmas, but Santa gives good boys and girls toys. So now I'm not so scared, as I always get toys on Christmas, so I must be a good kid. I still didn't tell him about the thing on the street though. December 24th, 2013. My parents will be gone for most of tonight and Christmas morning for some stupid work thing they both have. We usually have a Christmas at 6 a.m, but we have to wait for Mummy and Daddy to get home first. Mum told Brad, my oldest brother, that we would have a babysitter because she didn't trust him to watch all 5 of us by himself. Mum often let Brad watch us, but we had broken a lot of things the last couple of times we were left alone, so Mummy said she would get Rebecca to watch us instead. Rebecca came to the house at 5. She was very pretty and Brad couldn't stop staring at her. Mummy and Daddy left a couple of minutes after Rebecca got there, and this was the first time she had watched 6 kids all together. I don't think she knew what she was getting herself into. My youngest sister, Molly, who's 3, threw a tantrum after our parents left, and Levi and Garrett, my younger twin brothers who are both 5, started fighting. Brad talked with Rebecca most of the night, and Rachel spent most of it in her room. Mum and Dad said that we would still get Christmas gifts tomorrow, but we had to wait to open them until they got home. We made hot cocoa, but the cocoa maker was broken, so the hot chocolate burned our mouths, and we all got candy canes too. Rebecca started to put us to bed at 8, and had finally succeeded by 9:30. But even though she was clearly exhausted and frustrated with us, she told us she'd had fun and that she wouldn't have spent Christmas Eve any other way. Later that night I awoke at about 11 to see a crimson moon casting a dim red glow on the winter snow. I looked out of my bedroom window where I saw a red object coming towards our house, and fast. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a red sleigh being pulled by reindeer. I instantly recognized this as Santa's sleigh and ran to hide on the stairs, anxiously waiting for him to come down the chimney. Out of the window to the right of our fireplace, I saw the sleigh fly overhead and heard lots of hooves trotting about on the roof. I made sure to remain perfectly still and as silent as a mouse, but I waited for what felt like an eternity, whilst soft footsteps echoed on the roof above me. Getting closer to the chimney, I heard scuffling as ash and dust started falling from the fireplace. Soon, 2 black boots landed. Then the rest of jolly old St. Nick came through the fireplace with a bag of toys on his back. Without speaking a word, he went straight to our tree, took gifts from his bag and scattered them under our lit-up plastic evergreen. Then he started on the milk and cookies we'd left for him, and I felt that I'd held my breath the entire time I'd been hiding on the stairs. I couldn't believe I was spying on the real Santa Claus in my own home. Eventually he made his way over to our stockings and started putting various knickknacks and candies in them, starting with Molly. When he got to Levi, he took out a small, black rock and eyed it sadly before placing it in his stocking. It took me a second to realize that he'd given Levi coal, and stifled a laugh to the best of my abilities. But a small squeak escaped my lips, and Santa turned around to scan the room for the noise. I remained as still as ever as he turned back to the stockings, this time keeping his back to me as he put a piece of coal in Garrett's stocking too. He put a candy cane in Brad's stocking, along with a pocket knife, and Rachel got a new phone and some Kit Kats. Finally he moved to my stocking, which is always furthest to the right, even though I'm the middle child, and he began rummaging through his sack as I leaned forward excitedly to see what presents I was getting. Santa pulled out a large, jet-black piece of coal and stuffed it into my stocking, and I felt a wave of anger, sadness, and regret all at once. I almost stood up right then to tell off the jolly old elf, but when he turned around I saw tears in his eyes. He looked as if he was filled with similar emotions as I was, like he didn't like to have to give bad kids coal. It was for this reason that I remained quiet as Santa climbed back up my chimney, got into his sleigh and flew away. I watched out my downstairs window as the sleigh flew from the roof and into the black abyss of Christmas night. I sat there still in place for a very long time, pondering how I could be a better child next year, when I spotted something out through the window again. It looked like the same figure I'd seen before, but this time the sleigh looked as if it was black. I wrote this off as it was really dark outside, except for the moon's red glow, and I wondered why Santa would come back. Maybe he'd forgotten something. Maybe he'd made a mistake. Maybe I wasn't naughty and he was on his way back right now to fix it. My mind was racing from one thought to another as I began to hype myself up for all my possible Christmas presents, and I'd stopped watching the window and had begun to daydream about the next morning, until hooves on the roof interrupted my thoughts, loud, heavy clacking this time as he got closer to the chimney. Ash began to fall down again, creating a cloud around the fireplace. Then what I assumed to be Santa began coming down and landed with a loud crash. My final thought before seeing what came next was, how has no one else noticed all of this? Then through the cloud of thick black ash protruded two large horns with stripes of red and white, like those of a candy cane's, and as the dust settled, the rest of the figure was revealed. His skin was pale, icy-looking blue, his beard like Santa's, except it was black and came to a point. His nose was long and his face looked grizzled, but more human than I thought, and his horns looked like they'd touch the ceiling if he jumped. His body looked human in shape, but animal in design, and his legs were twisted and ended in hooves, like that of a cow or bull. He had a long tail, his torso was contorted, and everything but his face and palms were covered in fur. He had broken chains around his wrists, and what looked like a heavy red Christmas ornament attached to his tail by another chain. His ears were pointed, and so were his yellow teeth. But despite his horrid, outlandish appearance, the most noticeable things about the creature were the bells that it wore, and the basket on its back that had the limp arm of a child hanging from it. It was at that moment I realized that the stories were true. This was Krampus. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had seen sleighs go by, magic reindeer fly overhead, and had even seen Santa Claus himself. But none of that could have prepared me for this beast. He moved around the room with such speed that I was caught off guard, and this thing looked to be about 8 feet tall without its horns. With them, he towered over everything in our large home. He made his way to the fireplace and took the coal from Levi's stocking. He rolled it around in his long, bony fingers for a moment, then took the coal from Garrett's stocking, then finally mine. He studied it for a moment. A wide smile full of pointy yellow teeth beamed across his face. "Naughty little children," I heard it say in a cold, raspy voice, and a shiver ran up my spine as it spoke. I was paralyzed in both fear and awe at the creature that roamed my living room beneath me, and I thought he was moving towards the tree, but it walked past it and started going down the hallway into Levi and Garrett's bedroom. I then remembered the things my father used to say, that he whips bad kids, takes them away, sometimes eats them, sometimes shakes them, and he also scares them into being good. All these horrid thoughts and more danced through my head as the monster creeped into the twins' bedroom. I tried to scream with all my might, but no sound would escape my mouth. But as I was finally able to choke out, "Levi, Garrett!" Screams had already filled their room, and Levi came running out, screaming his head off as Garrett followed suit. The creature's long, twisted arm reached out from the door of the room and grabbed Garrett's leg, pulling him back in. I stood up from my spot on the stairs and motioned for Levi to come to me, and that's when Garrett's screams fell silent. The Krampus emerged from the room alone, his nose seeming shorter and his face even more deformed now. I gripped Levi's hand tightly and we ran for Brad's room. I wailed on his door again and again, but he wouldn't come out, and I would have tried harder to get his attention, but I could hear it coming up the stairs as its hooves hit each step. I took Levi to the laundry room and told him to hide in the chute. Then once he was inside, I began lowering the laundry hamper so he could get downstairs without confronting the monster. Before he was lowered out of sight, I told Levi to go start the hot cocoa maker, because I had a plan. He nodded, and once he got to the bottom, I felt the hamper get lighter as he climbed out. Hearing the hooved footsteps getting louder and closer to the laundry room, I began pulling the hamper up and climbed into it, just as the door was violently flung open, despite the locks on it. The beast licked its lips with its long, skinny tongue, and he slowly approached my trembling body inside the hamper. I began to bounce myself and rock the hamper as Krampus got closer and closer, but it wouldn't fall no matter how hard I rocked it, and the creature was soon upon me. I could feel its breath on me as it excitedly panted, and I expected its breath to be hot like that of a dog's, but instead it felt like the coldest winter chill caressing my skin. I shook the whole hamper as savagely as I could before it finally budged. Then it fell, and before I knew it, I was on the first floor. I crawled out of the chute and ran to the kitchen as the demon rampaged upstairs. Then as I came into the kitchen, I noticed no signs of my little brother, but I did see that the hot cocoa maker was on. The stomping upstairs continued, but didn't seem to be near the stairs, so I focused on finding Levi. He wasn't hiding in any cabinets, and he wasn't anywhere in the living room. He must be in his room, I thought, so I quietly and slowly creeped over, and the twins' room was completely trashed, but Levi wasn't there. There was blood on the wall, and I shuddered to think that it once belonged to my baby brother. I could see a small bloody handprint smeared on the wall by the door, and dread was all that I could feel in that moment. Dread for misbehaving all year, dread for what had become of my little brother, and dread for the silence that fell in place of hooves stomping around upstairs. I quickly and silently made my way back to the kitchen and took out a large coffee pitcher of scalding hot cocoa. Then as I crept out of the kitchen into the living room, I had an ominous feeling of dread as if I was being watched. I could barely see in the dark of the night, and I couldn't locate our light switches. The only source of light I had was the dim, eerie glow of the Christmas tree lights, and as I scanned all entrances to the dining room, something moving caught my eye. The chandelier had begun to start swinging, as if something had bumped into it or hit it. Then there was a soft thudding that accompanied the squeaking of the rocking corona. As I looked around to make out another vague shape in the glow of Christmas lights, I saw what had bumped the chandelier. The monster was on the ceiling, crawling like a large, twisted spider. His arms were bent in what to normal people would be excruciating, so it could grip the ceiling and watch me with his eyes burning on me like fire. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs at the very sight of it, but instead I held my ground, a cruel smile spreading across its face, the predator who was stalking me. He undug his fingers from the ceiling and landed on the floor in front of me with a thunderous crash, mere inches away from me. But this was his mistake. I threw the entire pitcher of burning hot cocoa in his face, and the beast immediately started writhing in agony. He covered his hands over his quickly blistering face. Then, pulling them away, his skin began to melt and peel off, bits of flesh and blood melting away to reveal its horrible skull, eyes still in their sockets. It froze for a while, and for a brief moment I was happily assured and content that Krampus was dead. But then it started cackling in an awful, disturbing and malevolent way. It pierced my ears like knives and loomed over me to instill as much fear as it could, and it was working. Before my very eyes, the muscles around the creature's skull started to grow back, and in seconds its new face had formed, looking more like a goat with pointy teeth than a human. Its beard was still as long as before, but now it looked almost out of place on its demonic head. It turned and ran behind the Christmas tree, avoiding the abomination's lanky arms as I ran by. Then it immediately started towards the tree, intent on harming me. I pushed the large plastic evergreen onto the monster and ran back upstairs to find my little brother, wailing on my other siblings' doors as I went. But no one would wake up, no matter how hard I pounded. Everyone locks their doors when we go to sleep, and they're all so heavy, and not much sound can get through them. So I began to shout for Levi as loud as I could, hoping that he would respond. Suddenly then, Levi appeared at the top of the stairs, and we stared at each other, him looking terrified and sad. I started towards him, so relieved and grateful he was okay, when out of nowhere, my baby brother was suddenly impaled by the horns of the beast. His body was thrust up and thrashed around the savage creature as he convulsed and shook on its spikes. I've seen people die on TV before, but watching it in real life is entirely different. No one should have to go through it. My brother didn't deserve that. No one deserves that. Santa and Christmas are about love and cheer, but Krampus made Christmas about hatred and retribution. I watched helplessly while the thing ripped my brother's shaking torso from its horns and dropped his lifeless body into the basket on his back. The demon then strutted towards me with obvious malicious intentions, so I ducked into Mum and Dad's empty room and opened the top right drawer in my dad's dresser. I wasn't tall enough to see what I was reaching for, but once I'd felt it, I pulled it out, and it was my dad's pistol. I opened the other dresser and loaded 2 bullets into it by the time the creature burst the door open, so I shot it twice and hit it both times. However, it was completely unfazed by the bullets, but the loud noise had clearly hurt both our ears, as the monster clawed at them whilst screaming in pain. I began to quickly crawl towards the window, when something long, thin, tight and slimy gripped my right leg and began pulling me back. I looked behind me, and to my terror I could see the Krampus was using its incredibly long tongue to pull me into its mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth. My breathing became rapid, and I was beyond a panic as my foot got closer to its mouth. Then I lifted my left leg, and as a reflex kicked it in the face twice before its tongue finally loosened. Before I could breathe, Krampus picked me up and began shaking me wildly, so I kicked him a second time, now with my right foot, and he flung me into the hallway where I began limping away as quickly as I could. I managed to reach the end of the hallway, when I suddenly heard a loud popping crack sound, moments before feeling a sharp sting across my back. Looking behind me, I saw the holiday devil had used a whip on me, and I felt the warmer ooze onto my back as new pain started setting in. I then tried again to limp away to safety, when I was picked up by Krampus again, his long cold fingers wrapping around my back, causing more pain to my fresh wounds, and he looked me right in the eyes before lifting me behind him and dropping me into the birch basket on his back. On the outside of the basket, it looked like it could only fit a couple of kids inside, but it was deceptive. The space in there was massive. I fell into a mountain of bodies piled on top of one another, all dead. Where you couldn't see other kids, which made up the trembling ground, you saw only darkness, and not one sound could be heard from inside. Kids would scream, mutter, shout until their throats clearly hurt, but no sounds came from their mouths. Every time I thought the situation couldn't get any worse, it did. I waited for what felt like a millennia to escape, as new kids would fall in and join the confusion to show how much time had passed. Eventually the Krampus reached into the basket and began to pull out another child, his arm becoming bigger as he reached in, and it stretched out to a panicked girl. I grabbed onto her leg and let myself be carried to salvation, and when we were pulled from the basket, I let go of the kid and fell to the floor behind the monster. He thankfully hadn't noticed I was there, as he was so focused on the girl, but he looked at the small girl for a second before biting into her flesh with his large, sharp teeth. I never knew her name before the creature had devoured her, but I owe her my life for helping me escape. I backed away slowly as he feasted on the girl at its dinner table, and I had absolutely no idea where I was now, but it was dark and cold. I knew that much. I could only deduce that it was where the creature lived. After the monster was finished eating, he picked up a small wooden box, opened it and spat something that glowed a bright red green into it. He then took the box over to a rusted door, opened it up, entered, then came back out a few minutes later without the box. He then left the room, leaving the child's remains on a large platter, with the rusty door left open for my curiosity. With the Krampus gone, I opened the door to see dozens of more wooden boxes, along with loads of creepy-looking porcelain dolls and other creepy toys. The door behind me closed suddenly. Then I was immersed in total darkness. I got out my phone and used it to barely light my way. Then I could see I was walking past a jack-in-the-box with a scary face, a baby doll that looked withered and old, and I found a sack doll that looked like a creepy rotting skeleton. I thought this place must be Santa's rejected toy shop, until I found the word Misfits smeared in red paint next to a clown with a skull for a head, blue eyes in its sockets and big fleshy hands. I was terrified someone else had been caught in that room before, but as I got closer to the clown, it jumped towards me and yelled, "Wanna play?" I jumped back in a fright as the clown let out a scary laugh. Then I heard scurrying and tiny footsteps of other toys from all around. I caught the dolls and gingerbread men turning their heads as I ran along the walls, trying to relocate the door, and that's when I found another message on the wall. "Why can't we die?" had been scratched into the wall by something. I wanted nothing more than for this night to end. When I finally located the door, I bolted for it as soon as I saw it, but was tripped up by a toy soldier with realistic burns on half its face. I kicked the tiny hunk of plastic away and moved closer to the door, when a deformed baby doll appeared from the darkness and sank her teeth into my leg. I felt a surge of pain and fell to the ground, furiously punching the doll's head repeatedly until it unlocked its tiny teeth from my flesh. The porcelain atrocity scurried off as other terrible toys danced around me in the darkness, and more of them kept popping up and coming out of the boxes, like the one Krampus had spat the glowing thing into. The toys then began muttering something I couldn't make out, but it got louder and louder until I understood some of their words. "Feel our pain. He killed us, but not entirely. He gobbled me up and spat my soul into a puppet. Kill us. Let us die." The things they said were dreadful, to say the least, and I got up and started to make my way to the door as the dolls chanted more obscene things. "We're gonna eat you alive like he ate us. I'm gonna rip your eyes out," they chanted. And although they continued to chant, none of them came towards me again as I moved around the dark room. saw a small toy skeleton in Santa's clothes with a beard move by. A puppet with nails sticking out of its wooden head was strung up to the ceiling too, moving and wrestling with its strings. I spotted a stool that was pulled up to a workbench with tools, and a teddy bear was on it that had real bear claws sticking from its paws and real human teeth in its mouth. I reasoned that this was Krampus's demented toy shop and decided to leave before it was too late. So I walked past the bench to the door and started pulling on the rusty metal handle. It was extremely heavy, but slowly budged and started opening as I pulled back with all my might. Light began to bathe the room, and the misfit toys dashed to the shadows to avoid it. So I ran from the dark room, closed the door behind me, and leaned on it for a while to catch my bearings. I looked around at the only other room in this place that was familiar to me, and I went by the long table the monster had eaten the nameless girl, trying not to think about it, just trying to think of something, anything to distract me from the horrors I had witnessed on the most unsuspecting and happiest time of year. I walked to an open door and poked my head slightly out to scan the perimeter of the room that led to a large room that had various whips, saws, and other torture devices. I stayed where I was and kept to the wall, then spotted 3 wooden doors amongst the darkness and concrete walls. I also found a window, and the snow outside was falling so slowly, so peacefully. 2 doors were on the one large wall, opposite the window, and the other was on the wall to the right of the window. I first tried one of the doors on the long wall, but had decided beforehand to go to the door right of the window, thinking it would lead me closer to freedom. The walls were lined with racks, and the racks were lined with hellish masks. Some had horns, some had long serpent tongues sticking out, some had teeth, some had patches of skin, and some had antlers that had lit candles on them. It was all so strange. The room was so large, and the other door led to the same room. I left without moving the door, in fear that closing it would create noise and would lead the creature to me. So I walked alongside the wall to avoid the equipment, and straight to the only door that I had left. So I opened it slowly and with caution, and the first thing in the room I noticed was a strange tree that looked like an upside-down purple Christmas tree. The trunk was on the bottom, but the pines and branches looked upside down, and it was decorated with red and green lights and small bones. There was another window in this room, but it was on the same side as the last, and there was an open doorway that led to a hallway that teed off with 2 signs labeling the directions. The right one said surveillance room, and the left one said stables. I went to the stables thinking I might be able to find a reindeer to fly out of that place with. It seemed like a silly plan now in hindsight, but I opened the stable door, and there was frost carpeting the floor, and awful smells invaded my nostrils immediately. There were 8 stables lined up along the wall to the right, each with demonic reindeer heads sticking out. Below each head were the doors to each stall, and they had pendants with their names on. I read the names out loud as I started down the row, and each deer was grotesque in their own right. 1 or 2 had exposed skulls, each had jagged teeth. Some had manes, and others had dried blood on their fur. For 7 of them, their eyes glowed red. Slasher, I said as I passed the first one. Wrathful, Gorgon, Putrid, Cyclops. Cyclops was missing 1 fiery eye. Rabies, Goner. And the last monstrous reindeer looked like a hellish Rudolph. His head held flames that danced from its gnarled snout to the back of its mane, and between its sharpened, bloody antlers furiously flickered bolts of electricity. Its name was Blitzkrieg. I decided riding one was out of the question, so began searching for an exit, but quickly realized that the only door to the room was the one I had come from. I looked all over, looking for some other way out, and found a reason for the cold. The top crease and upper part of one wall was missing and led outside, but it was far too high to reach, so I left the stable room and went into the surveillance room. The handle felt icy cold as I slowly opened the door, and the room, like all the rest, was large with one wall covered with monitors. The bottom, middle monitor stuck out more than the rest, and it had a keyboard and a chair pulled up to it. Each screen had various kids on it, some in dreadful conditions, others minding their own business. But no sound came from the monitors. And that's when I started to notice I was hearing a ticking noise. A clock above the door I'd come in from read 5:45. Christmas Day didn't start at my house until 6 o'clock. The wall opposite the monitors had many names scratched into them, and I wondered if the dead girl's name was there. Then I spotted a door that read exit. That was to the right of the monitors, but the computer said search name. I sat in the large chair and typed in Garrett Rockford, and a nutcracker that had 2 bodies attached from the sides of its head popped up, each body looking like they were trying to yank away from the other. Its face looked like it was in pain, and it had the same color eyes as Levi and Garrett. I looked up Levi Rockford, and the same thing popped up, and I sat frozen in awe for a moment. Tears filled my eyes and ran down my cheeks, and the ticking of the clock seemed to turn into clopping as I sobbed. I was crying more than I have ever cried before. I cried so hard I began hearing a ringing, and that's when the chair I was in spun around, and I was face to face with Krampus. He looked menacing and insidiously sinister, his horns partly covered in blood. His long fingers looked sharp, and his eyes burned like never before as he waved his long, sharp, bony finger at me and tisked. "Naughty, naughty," he said cruelly and mockingly. Then he licked my face with his incredibly long tongue, then began to wrap it around my throat. He constricted his tongue and choked me as I gurgled, coughed and struggled, which did nothing. I started feeling weaker and weaker as my head heated up and my lungs screamed for air. My vision even started to become blurred, and I knew if I didn't do something quickly, I was going to die. I punched him in the face with all my might and knocked him back for only a brief moment as his tongue recoiled into his mouth. Then I utilized my time and ran towards the exit as fast as I could, feeling the ground shake directly beneath me as heavy hooves shook the floor violently in their wake. I felt the creature's cool breath on the back of my neck as I pushed the door open and ran into the freezing cold as my pursuer followed suit. I ran until I was knee-deep in snow, until a lanky hand gripped me and started dragging me back. The dark sky slowly lit as the sun started to emerge from the bottom of the horizon. Then suddenly Krampus stopped dragging me. He dropped me and stared briefly at the rising sun. "I'll be back to get you again," he said as he dropped my leg and retreated to his lair as I lay in the snow. A silhouetted figure came from a distance, and I closed my eyes for what felt like seconds. But when I opened them, the sun was higher in the sky, and the figure was closer. I could make out that he was wearing red, then I passed out again. After a while I opened my eyes to see an outstretched hand with a black mitten on it. It belonged to a fat, bearded man with a silly hat. "Santa?" I inquired. "Shh, child," he said in a soft, soothing voice. "Let's take you home." The next thing I remember was waking up in my bed at home where Levi and Garrett were kidnapped in the middle of the night. I found out from Rebecca, Brad and Molly, who'd already told our parents and the cops, but I tried to tell them what had really happened. But of course, no one believed me. They only got mad when I tried to explain it to them, so I gave up on trying. And that's how I spent my Christmas. My eyes shot open, reflexively tightening up as I looked towards the door. It was 12:01 a.m. Christmas morning, and at any moment the door to the bedroom was going to burst open, and my 2 beautiful children are going to run in giggling with presents already in hand. But seconds passed and nothing happened. It took me a full minute before I remembered that no one would be coming through the door this year. The accident was only a couple of months ago, and I'd wake up most mornings for the briefest moment every day and forget that they were gone. I find myself lying in bed, listening for their laughter or cries for breakfast, filling the house, just before the pain of losing them hits me as fresh as the day it happened. It was a car accident that took them away from me. I was supposed to pick them up after school, but work ran late, so I called my daughter Samantha, who was 13, 3 years older than her brother Ryan, and told her they would have to walk home. It was only a couple of blocks, and they had done it plenty of times before, so it wasn't a big deal at all. Except that day it would be. She was only a kid herself, around the age of 25, and didn't see them crossing the street. She was probably texting, eating, or doing one of the 100 other things people do whilst driving, instead of paying attention to the road. But it didn't matter what she was doing. She hit both of them, and they didn't make it. Ryan died right there on the road. Then the ambulance tried to save Samantha by taking her to the hospital in time to save her. But they weren't fast enough, and in the time span of 20 minutes, my life was destroyed. Janet, my wife at the time, blamed me. Of course she did. It wouldn't have happened if I'd have just picked them up as I was supposed to. She made it through the funeral and burials before leaving me, and thinking back, I couldn't blame her. I can't stand the sight of myself either. That's why all the mirrors in the house are shattered, and why the gun I bought last week was already loaded and waiting on the nightstand by the empty bed. All of these thoughts rushed through my head as I dragged myself out of bed and hung my head in my hands. It was the first Christmas I've had to spend alone, the house dark and empty. This time last year, the kids were awake and already opening the one special present they'd picked out to start this joyous day with. The tree would be lit, casting a festive glow in the living room. The smell of cocoa and coffee would be strong in the air. But it was the laughter and joy that would wake me up the most. As a parent, there is nothing better than seeing your kids excited and happy. And nothing does that more than opening presents on Christmas Day. I closed my eyes and tried to collect my thoughts. But just then, a sound from the living room grabbed my attention. It sounded like the soft thud of little feet trying to be quiet as they snuck through the house. A sound I'd not heard in months. Shuffling off the bed, I made my way towards it, and opening the door to the bedroom, I looked out to an empty living room. This is where they would be sitting, right under the tree, presents in hand, waiting for a sign they could start ripping into them. But of course no one is there now, and the room is dark. The fake tree still in its box, propped up against the wall and unopened. It hurt too much to try to get ready for Christmas without them, and it hurt too much to try. Looking at the empty living room, I could almost feel them there, sitting legs crossed, looking towards our bedroom, waiting to see if we were ready. They would each get to open their one present, and then get whatever was in their stockings, mostly little dollar store trinkets and candy. But it was still exciting to them, even though they were getting too old for the cheap toys. It was never going to be that way again, though. This holiday of love and joy for everyone else will be a constant reminder of what I've lost, made worse by the fact that all other families, neighbours, and even strangers are coming together and putting aside their differences to have this one special day together. And here I am alone. The weight of the gun in my hand snapped me back to the cold, dark room that was my life, reminding me there was still a way out. I looked towards the tree and imagined like it was last year. Blue and silver twine circling bright blue LCD lights, superhero and Disney character ornaments from theme parks and rest stops the kids always had to have, decadent glass orbs that were a wedding gift, and the 2 angels looking back at me smiling and waiting for me to join them. I'm coming, I thought as I felt the cold metal of the gun barrel against my temple and pulled the trigger. The sound was louder than anything I've ever experienced, and I heard it a fraction before the pain hit. It was so loud I couldn't see, and the world went black as all my senses faded, and all I could feel then was the roar between my ears. When the pain finally came, it was almost a relief. The sound didn't stop, but my focus shifted from an earth-shattering rumbling to a drill-like sensation that started in my temple and started boring inwards. The combination of the sound and pain dropped me to my knees, and the gun slipped from my hand. Reflexively then, my hands shot up to the source of the pain, but found nothing, not a mark at the spot where I'd just seconds ago pulled the trigger. "Can we open our presents now, Daddy?" a voice said, cutting through the pain, and I struggled to open my eyes to find the source. The dark, empty room I was in moments ago had now transformed when my eyes finally pried open. The first thing I noticed was that everything was bathed in a red flickering light, the glow coming from the back wall where the unopened Christmas tree box used to sit, and now in its place was a fully decorated tree. Instead of the blue and silver of years past, the tree was now dressed in red tinsel and lights that contained actual flickering flames that gave the appearance of the tree being consumed by fire. Blood-red ornaments seemed to drip the light throughout the tree and reflected the glow around the room. Then there, sitting on the floor in front of me, presents in hand, were my beautiful children. Their matching green Christmas pajamas tinged red from the glowing tree, making them look muddy and unclean. Their backs were to me, but from where I was standing, I could see something wasn't right. Ryan's small arm was bent unnaturally at the elbow, giving it an insect-like appearance, and the hand that rested on his present was twitching uncontrollably. His fingers were tapping on the wrapping paper of the present, and at first it seemed like he was merely trying to open it, but the more I watched, I could tell it was an involuntary spasm of pain. The floor under Samantha's crossed legs was covered in blood, and I couldn't tell if it was coming from her or the present on her lap. Maybe both. Her head turned towards me, and when I could just about see her face, her head flopped back on a clear broken neck, her empty jet black eyes looking directly at me, a thin red trail of blood escaping her mouth and travelling upwards to her face, finally pooling in the corner of her right eye. "Can we open our presents now, Daddy?" she asked again, her voice deeper than I remembered, also with none of the joy or light she had when she was alive. I had to get out of the house. The pain in my head was unbearable, was diluting my equilibrium, and I managed to stumble out of the front door. Outside was almost pitch black as all the lights on the street and neighbouring buildings were off, the only source of light coming from a full blood moon casting an odd dark orange hue over everything in sight. Just then a loud, wet-sounding thud caught my attention from down the road, and I slowly made my way to the apartment building there. The pain was coming in waves, and pressure was building up in my skull, blinding me in the process. It got so bad that I fell to my knees again, and there was nothing or no one that could help. The street was empty. The businesses and houses along the road were boarded up and looked abandoned, and nothing looked like it had yesterday. Once I was finally able to get moving, though, I saw a light on in a living room a couple of houses down on the right of where I'd fallen. I walked towards the light and could see a figure standing at the window, looking out towards the road in my direction. It was a woman, pale white skin, wearing a white wedding dress. As I got closer, she raised her hand as if waving to me, and I saw the marks on her arm. There was a long 4-inch slit starting from where her palm met her wrist, right down to her mid-forearm. Blood slowly pumped out in thick rivulets down her arm and onto her white dress, staining it instantly. The pain flared up again and I stumbled in front of the window. She looked down at me then, almost understandingly, before she turned and disappeared inside her house. We couldn't help each other, but just as she seemed to understand what I was going through, I felt I understand her loss too. It was this day, Christmas Day. For most it was a reminder of what they had, but for us it was too much of a reminder of what had been lost. I collected myself for a moment before another loud wet thud brought me back. Then I pushed onwards, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. The street's Christmas decorations were still up, but the lights were all dead, and the usual joyful colours of forest green wreaths and red candy canes looked dull and corroded on the seemingly abandoned buildings. Ripped and haphazardly hung tinsel clung in patches to the dark streetlights, when just then movement above me caught my attention. Hanging from the streetlight, almost hidden by moss-colored tinsel, was a slightly overweight man. He looked to have been dead for some time, and his dark features, made even more obscure by the pooling of blood in his face, reflected the fact that he had a noose around his neck where he hung from. His large fat tongue stuck out between thick swollen lips, like a diseased overgrown worm, and he was dressed in a dirty Santa suit that seemed to have a lot of wear and not enough care put into it. I could smell the sweet and vile mixture of alcohol and vomit, and another wave of pain and pressure made me collapse into a ball directly under the man. Suddenly the unkempt Santa's eyes shot open, and he looked at me. He began to struggle against the rope, holding him to the streetlight, his legs kicking, rocking himself violently back and forth whilst grunting for help. Just another sad soul claimed by this unholy night. All I could do was crawl forward, the pain keeping me from getting to my feet. I couldn't help the man. I couldn't help my own family, and I can't even help myself. I heard the thud again, but this time it was right beside me. The sound was a wet smack of flesh hitting something solid, so I rolled over onto my side to try to get a look at what was making that horrid sound. I was then staring into the bloodshot eyes of a man in a bloody and ripped-up tailored suit. His body was smashed and broken, blood leaking from his eyes and mouth into a dark, neatly trimmed jet-black goatee. He must have fallen from the building to my left, which was some kind of office, but I couldn't tell what company. Reading and moving my head too much caused the pain to intensify. As I looked into the man's eyes, his pupils began to shift, and he seemed to be trying to focus on me. His bones looked to rearrange themselves in his face and jaw, his mouth twisting into a surprised frown. He tried to raise himself up on his hands and knees, but the bones in his forearms were shattered, and jagged cream-tinted shards were breaking through the skin. He shrieked in agony and collapsed back onto his stomach. I could hear the horrible grinding and tearing sound as his body shuddered, but all I could do was watch in horror as the bones retreated into his skin, whilst he screamed as he forced his way upright once again. Standing in front of me, I could see that his body was almost completely healed. His left arm still hung lower off his shoulder socket, and he stood on an ankle that was bent sideways at an angle that could only mean the bone was still broken, but all pain seemed to have left him. Instead, what replaced the agony on his face just moments before was now a puzzled bewilderment. As if I wasn't even there, he searched the surrounding area like he was looking for something he'd just lost. Quickly he found what he was looking for and straightened himself out, and I could see he was now standing there with a worn and battered briefcase in his hand. He adjusted what was left of his blooded Christmas tree tie and walked back into the building that I suspected he'd fallen from. If you happened not to see the dark spreading blotches of blood or the rips and tears in his suit, he would just look like any other corporate businessman going to work Christmas morning. I felt then a desperate need to get out of there no matter what, so ignoring the debilitating pain, I stood up and blindly started running, not caring about the direction I was headed. The only goal was to escape the awful things I'd been witnessing, and nothing was going to slow me down. Not the pain, not the nauseating roar in my head, not even the loud wet thud of a body hitting the pavement behind me. I didn't stop running until my legs could no longer carry me, until out of breath I stumbled upon an abandoned house. The pain was too intense at that point, but I fought the urge to lie down, and using my shoulder I forced the door to the house open, tripping into the living room. It was dark inside, and the fake tree was still in its box propped up against the wall, unopened. It hurt too much not to get ready for Christmas without them, and it hurt too much to try. But looking at the empty living room, I could almost feel them there, sitting legs crossed looking towards our bedroom, waiting to see that we were ready. They would each get to open their one present, and then get whatever was in their stockings. Mostly little dollar store trinkets and candy, but it was still exciting to them, even though they were getting too old for the cheap toys. But it was never going to be that way again. I felt the weight of the gun in my hand. I imagined seeing my kids sitting by the tree. I imagined Christmas how it was supposed to be, the best day of the year, the time when you are with your family and loved ones and all the pain is gone. I want their smiling faces to be the last thing I think about. And I put the gun to my head, tears welling up in my eyes. I pulled the trigger. The sound was louder than anything I have ever experienced, and it came before the pain. The Allen family are jovially celebrating and having a great time, and the Christmas spirit has never been stronger. Absolutely nothing could ruin this lovely evening. The Allen father excused himself, saying that he was going to retrieve an unspecified item, then left the dining room with his family awaiting his return. However, unbeknownst to the children, the father would appear again, but wearing a Santa's costume, acting as a gift bringer for the family, spreading Christmas joy. But Santa never came. With this unusual absence of the father, the evening soured. The children loudly wailed. Grandpa got angry. Grandma wept. And the mother's worries grew worse. The Allen father never returned. And what was turning out to be the greatest Christmas Eve of all ended up to be the most horrible of them all. Really a night to remember. Despite his absence, the Allen family moved on with their lives, never getting over the frustrating disappearance of their dear father. Years passed, the children grew up, Grandma and Grandpa died, the mother remarried, and lastly the house where the haunting Christmas Eve had taken place was sold. But it didn't take long for another tragedy to befall the house. An unknown source caused it to catch fire, and it completely burned down. Nothing was left. The little of which had remained of the house was the chimney that had toppled down during the fire. And when authorities investigated, they discovered the answer to the mystery of that tragic Christmas Eve from so many years ago. They found the skeleton of Santa Claus. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.